What a joy to be back here, and I want to do a special shout out to Reverends Debbie and Alan Moss. So good to see you too. And you know, it's funny because during the greeting, I'm saying hello to Reverend Debbie, and I'm like, boy, she looks familiar. And she says, I'm Debbie Moss, and I went, oh my gosh. I don't know if you remember, we first met in 2010 through Community Tampa Bay. So that was my employment at the time, and I had come to talk with Reverend Debbie and then had the benefit of being able to hear her at First Unity in St. Petersburg, and just wonderful to see you two here. So this is a joy always to come back to Unity of Tampa. I said this the last time I was here, but every time I'm asked to speak, things synchronistically fall into place here. I've spoken throughout Florida, but for some reason, I think you're in a pocket, you know, like they have in England, those good energy zones that go across the ground. This sanctuary is one. And everything falls into place like that daily word today. I did not look at the daily word book and plan my talk around that. It just happened. It's miraculous, and I love it. We are, Sharon and I, enjoying life. We're enjoying the ups, and we're learning to enjoy more the downs, learning from them. And my talk today, Becoming Me, is kind of centered around that, because I think that for all of us, in those times when we hit those plateaus or even those caverns that just kind of, when the ground drops out from under you, through conflict, through situations that hit out of the blue, and we struggle with how do we live through that? How do we continue to be our best self? It might even be a problem that we've caused from a mistaken choice. And I turn to those people around me. Either they are authors, or they may be archetypes, or even current souls in my life. And I say, well, how are they living, and how do they show up that I want to show up as? And it always makes me think of this one guy that Sharon and I both know, and he is a true teacher for both of us. He, without a doubt, is someone who can transition very quickly. Things may happen, he may make a mistake, he may get into a conflict, but as I watch him, he transitions and he shows the essence of himself very, very well. He's kind, he's courteous, he's full on with attention when he's in the room with you and you're speaking with him. He's funny and he's smart, and he has that joie de vivre, that joy of life that I want to always live as. And I say, I want to live like him. You have souls in your life like that? And the expression even on his face, his countenance, is just that joy. Duncan, can you put a picture up for me, please? This is Reno. Reno is our 5-pound Min Pinchy Puzu. He's half full-blooded, long-haired Chihuahua, and the other half, these were UK show dogs, the other half, miniature pincher, miniature poodle, and Shih Tzu. So there you go, Min Pinchy Puzu. But I say this because we can have teachers that are in nature, that are our animal. And here's the great thing. Even though he's not human, he has things happen in his life, and he transitions through them. He's a rescue. He was not intentionally abused. The gentleman who had him was older and could not take care of him. Through a lack of nutrition, he had some very poor liver and kidney issues when we got him, and we nursed him back. And he recovered, and he is wonderfully healthy and full of joy. You can go back to the title talk now, thank you. You doesn't have to stay up there the whole time. And prior to Reno, we had another dog named Nixie, who also was a rescue. But he was not unintentionally abused. He was intentionally abused. And when I got him at 3 to 4 years old, he was due to be put down because he could not get along with other dogs, with human beings. For the first 3 to 4 years that I had him, depending on how I would respond, if I moved too quickly, he would interpret it from his learned behavior as me wanting to attack him. I was bitten on my hand, on my arms, on my neck, on my cheek, on my ear, on my nose, on my buttocks, on my legs, anywhere he could grab to say no. Because every human being in his life had trained him in his thought process to be aware, to be afraid, and that's how he reacted. I'd never given him cause to react that way with me, but that's how he reacted. And it makes me think that this learned behavior that even animals attain after years of abuse is something that we as humans actually intellectually produce for ourselves much quicker than that. For example, you heard me say before, I believe that we choose our nuclear family. I believe that as the eternal self, me, that is one with Source, I know the certain capacities that I want to experience in this lifetime. And I make eternal agreements with certain souls to say, we are going to teach each other and do this dance. Doesn't always feel like that in this physical timeline, but I believe that. And here's the example. My sister and I are the only two in our family. She's 5 years older than me. We only lived together the first 13 years of my life in the same household, because at that point she was 18, she went off to college. But there is nobody in this world who can push my buttons or trigger me faster than my sister. Why? We only knew each other for a solid 13 years. I love her dearly, but I know that it's my story. It is a creation that I produced. There is something that happens within us that we become familiar, and we've heard the saying, we create our own filters, and that's how we then see the future things through. 13 years of growing up as a child and then an adolescent, and still at age 50, I respond to things in an office environment or in a social setting or with another person whom I've just met, based in part, often, on that parameter, how I've learned that behavior. There's an author, he's a New Thought author / scientist named Dr. Joe Dispenza. He wrote a wonderful book called Breaking the Habit of Being Yourself. I love the title of that. And he talks about, he was a student of biochemistry at Rutgers University with an emphasis on neuroscience. And he talks about this thing of filters and how we've actually created those and what they stem from. And here's the example that he gives. When we're in a situation, a conflict, an argument, we've made a bad decision, something that is not right within our lives, we experience a certain thought process, and it triggers the neurons to fire from A to B. Now, you're going to hear me reference science a little bit throughout this talk, because I truly believe that as human beings, we are mental, spiritual, emotional, physical. We're not one or the other, and coming into this body doesn't separate us. Sometimes we tend to categorize ourselves, but the wonderful interplay that we have as co-creators is that when we see how they all balance out, we see even more the power of our own co-creative ability. So he talks about how these neurons fire, and as they fire, they tell our hypothalamus, our thymus, our adrenal, you need to release some hormones to respond. So we've had, say, an argument with somebody, or a bad situation at work, or something's going on in our marriage, or with our children, or with our parents. It happens at this point in time. But how many of you are like me, and you might bring it the next day and repeat the argument in your head? Or project into the future and say, well, based on that past argument, they might say this, like a little chess game, a verbal chess game in our head. And what Dr. Dispenza says is, what we're doing is we're refiring those same neural connections, A to B, A to B, A to B. And he says the more that we fire them, nerve cells that fire together wire together. We create a deeper path, so it becomes more familiar. It then becomes the filter we see things through. It's a trench that we dig deeper and deeper and deeper, because we keep going from A to B. It has nowhere to go, so it goes back to A, then goes back to B. And at the same time, it's releasing these hormones throughout our bodies that we actually become addicted to. Are we at the whim of that chemistry, that biochemical reaction? No. Because who created the trench in the first place? Right? There was an interesting study that was done in 2013. 7 researchers wanted to actually see this process. How is it that our thoughts create this neural pattern which then creates a behavior, which then creates a habit. How is it? Where is it going on? And they hooked up a group of folks to an MRI so they could see it happening. They interviewed them, and they found out, what are your triggers? Are you married? Are you divorced? Are you not speaking to any of your siblings? Do you have any problems with your parents, with your children? What are they? And they individually created scenarios that they could then put out to the group of people who were being tested. And they watched in this first scenario as they created a trouble situation. They saw that these thoughts were actually going from one point to the other, the A to B, and stopping. And they asked them, how do you feel? I feel restricted. I feel closed. I feel stuck. I'm angry. I'm afraid. So then they took it to the next level, and they created a solution for them. They created an area of forgiveness. They created an empathy aspect to the scenario to release this. And they found that it no longer just went from A to B, it then went to C. Point C, which had 4 or 5 different areas of the brain, and they said, what do you feel now? And they said, I feel open. I feel relieved. I feel peaceful. And the amazing thing is that this study is actually on mapping forgiveness in our brains and what it does and the chemical response and how forgiveness of ourselves, of other people, of the situation, the acceptance that goes through that actually has a physical effect and can create or unwire the behavior that we've learned before. I find that fascinating because we know in New Thought that when we think things, that which we think on comes to fruition. And it's almost like science is catching up to say, oh, well, that's why it happens. So if we know that we can change the patterns, how do we do it? Joe Dispenza, in his book, Breaking the Habit of Being Yourself, has a prompt that I want to start with as my first of 5 steps to follow, to make that change in our lives, to become our best selves, to step into, I would say, our best selves. And the first step is one word. When we're in that process of repeating, this is the argument that I was in, this is the situation at work, they said this to me and I can't believe it, oh, I really messed up on that, I'm so bad, I'm so bad, I'm so bad, right? Flogging with thoughts repeatedly. When we find ourselves doing it, when we're intentionally aware, say one word to yourself, change. Not stop. Stop tells your brain, okay, stop, but doesn't give it any further direction. So it goes back to the A to B, digging that trench deeper and deeper. Change makes us go, well, change to what? Leads to the next question. Number 2, then, is ask, have I done all that I can do? Have I thought about why this is bothering me? Do I know why I'm afraid? Do I know why I'm angry? Do I know what this is triggering in me? Do I believe that it's true? Do I know why I'm upset with that person? Have I been honest with myself, taken ownership of my actions, forgiven not only them but myself? Can I do that? You know, sometimes it's hard to do, and we need a sounding board. We need somebody else there with us, which is wonderful to have as a community. I was having this conversation once with a friend, and she said, yeah, no, you're right. Everybody needs somebody to hold us accountable for our mistakes. And I said, well, actually, I really believe that everyone needs someone to hold me accountable for being my best self. Because the difference there is, I don't want somebody to come to me and say, you did that wrong, that was bad, you did it again, you always do that, you need to really look at that, why are you keep doing that, you do this behavior and over again. I would rather that somebody said to me, okay, that happened. That's 1% of you, 0.1% of all that you are and all that you're capable of. How can we look at this and how can you step into who you really are? How can you be in the world what you want to be? How can I support you in that? You feel the difference? One is very restrictive. The other is very opening and empowering. So find that person in your life. I am very grateful that I have that in my wife. When something is very much on my mind or bothering me, or my behavior is less than, I can go to her and I can say, I need you to sit with me and help me remember who I am. Be in this space with me so that I can do that. Step 3, number 1, change. Number 2, have I done all that I can do? Number 3, sometimes this is a hard step. Write 3 gratitudes about the person or the situation that you're in. I believe gratitude is prayer. It's a form of prayer. It's not thinking from our heads. It's coming from our hearts and saying, I truly am grateful for this because it's a way of sending out that energy that heals. There was a study done that's really mind-boggling to me. In July of 2000, Dr. Leonard Lebovici in Israel went to a local hospital and he pulled the names of 3,393 patients. I remember the number because it's cool, 3393. He did the gold standard of studies, medical studies. That is a randomized, double-blind, controlled trial. It's the gold standard because randomized means by chance this group of 3,000 plus people were split into 2 groups. It's double-blind. Dr. Lebovici nor the patients, neither one of them knew who was in what group. And it's controlled. They had set parameters. He was controlling for, all of these patients had sepsis from being in the hospital. And he was controlling to see how does prayer affect people. So he had a group of prayer warriors pray for this group A that the computer randomly selected, and group B just sat in the filing cabinet. And he didn't know who they were until at the end of prayer time, he pulled the information from the hospital and he found out their statistics, looking for those 2 things, length of stay in the hospital and duration of fever, which accompanies sepsis. You know what I'm going to say, and that the length of stay and the duration of fever were both far less for the group that was prayed for. The group that was prayed for, their average length of stay in the hospital was 165 days. The group that was not, the average was 320, double. That's amazing. I want to throw in another little scientific yah-yah. That is, we consider a true study legitimate when it has a p-value that's acceptable. Below 5 is good. Now, a p-value indicates this. What's the likelihood that this happened purely by chance? If it's 5% or less, the scientific community has agreed, well, if there's only a 5% chance that chance influenced this, it's pretty good value that we can say that whatever the test model was, in this case prayer, impacted those 2 groups. For the length of stay in the hospital, the p-value was 0.01. It was a 1% chance that chance alone impacted that these people stayed in the hospital for half the time as the non-prayed for. Now, I love that in itself, but here's where it gets really wild. This study was done in July of 2000. The patients were pulled from the hospital's roster. They had been in there in 1990 through 1996. They prayed backwards in time. I know. Einstein calls this part of quantum physics spooky science. It's like you go, what? How did that happen? You know, we don't have to figure that out. But what I love about prayer, and gratitude being that form of prayer, is that it's going to impact what is happening currently in our lives, as well as what happened before and what comes next. That's awesome. That's awesome. 1, change. 2, have I done everything I can do? 3, list 3 gratitudes. Don't forget yourself. Sometimes we take care of everybody else, but we don't turn inside and say, it's all right, I'm going to put my flogger down and I'm going to thank myself for taking the time to recognize who I really am. Number 4, what's the value or virtue in this current situation that you would like to show up as in the world? If you're having a conflict with somebody, who do you want to be? Do you want to be compassion? Do you want to be kindness? Do you want to be peace? Do you want to be love? Do you want to be forgiveness? What is that value that you want to show up as? Once you have that in mind, take that into meditation. Open the heart, fill in it, meditate on that value, that virtue. What does it feel like? How do you feel when you think of compassion? And then imagine yourself as compassion. What does that feel like? What is every aspect of that? What does it feel like to be peace, to be forgiveness? Sit with it. I have to share another study with you. 1992, two doctors, another group of people, they like to split them in half. That's what they do. Split this group of people in half. And for the group A, they said, okay, we want to measure the increase of strength in your finger from flexing exercises. So we're going to measure everybody's ahead of time, and then we're going to ask group A to take your finger, your index finger, and flex it. So everybody, would you just do that for me for a second? Okay. Let's do it for about 10 seconds. You can feel how this impacts your wrist, your forearm. You can feel that. You can stop if you want to. The doctor said, all right, what we want you to do is to do this for 1 hour, 5 days a week, for 4 weeks. That's a lot, right? But they did. The other group, they said, okay, group, we're talking about flexing our fingers. What we want you to do is flex your finger in your mind for 1 hour, 5 days a week, for 4 weeks. I think this group had it better off because that's hard to do. That's concentration. Then they came back and they measured them all again. Group A, as expected, had an increase in physical strength of an average of 30% increase. Group B, they weren't quite sure what was going to happen, but they too had an increase of strength. 22%. 22%, only 8% less than those who physically did the activity. And the doctors, and I'm quoting, concluded that the neural origin of strength increases before muscle. The neural origin of strength, that is, our thoughts create the ability for us to grow prior to it manifesting in our physicality. So when you've picked that virtue or that value and you sit with it in meditation and you really sit with that and experience it and feel what it feels like, know you are increasing the ability to be that virtue in the world. You are creating new neural pathways to show up as compassion, as gentleness, as peace and love and kindness and forgiveness in the world because of that practice. I love that. Step 5, think of somebody who epitomizes that value to you. When you think of, for example, compassion, I think of the Dalai Lama, I think of Mother Teresa. When I think of kindness, I think of Ellen DeGeneres. She always says, be kind to one another. When I think of gratitude, I think of my wife. She's a very grateful person. Who in your life, or who that you can think of, is that archetype for you? And then as you're sitting in that place of holding that value in your heart and your body, have them step into you. Imagine that. Kind of like, remember the movie Ghost with Patrick Swayze and Demi Moore? He just stepped right on in to Whoopi Goldberg. Be that. Sit with that. What does that feel like? If I showed up as this person in my life, what does that feel like? Who can I become? We have the ability to change our behavior, to correct things, to learn more, Becoming me is less about becoming and more of becoming aware of who I really am, right? And we can do that because we can choose to live like the person, the virtue that we admire. Live like Reno. Thank goodness we have pets to remind us of eternal, uninhibited love and joy. John is going to come forward and we're going to start into our meditation here shortly. And I want you to think of what that virtue would look like.